So something that I'm really curious to start out with is, you know, you started out with some activity in 1999, at least from some very basic reading with some research into mitochondria. And then you also ran into a little bit of a argument with some people with the MIT Technology Review in 2005. And then the SENS Foundation itself was at least formally started in 2009. So I'm curious about what happened within that timeline,
Okay.
and in particular, like what to you stood out as a real green light for you to really go whole hog on the SENS Foundation.
Yeah, great question. So actually, let me extend the period that I will describe a little bit.
Excellent.
So let's start instead of 1999, let's start about 95, 94 kind of period. That was the kind of time when I decided that I had to switch fields. Because since probably 1992 or 3, I had been gradually coming to terms with the terrifying and catastrophic discovery that almost all biologists viewed aging as not their problem and not interesting and not important. I had married a biologist in 1991, and it was, of course, through her that not only did I learn a lot of biology accidentally over the dinner table, but also I found this out that she just wasn't, she just thought, like, so what? Like, it's not interesting. And she was by no means the exception, she was the norm in biology.
Hmm.
So, yeah, by about 95, I decided this can't go on. And you're right that mitochondria, and in particular mitochondrial DNA and the mutations that it accumulates during aging, were my first area of interest. They were the area that I really got zeroed in on. Excuse me. Not for any particularly good reason, but in retrospect anyway. But yeah, that's where I started. And I published a few papers on the mechanisms whereby mitochondrial mutations accumulate and why they matter, how they actually become disproportionately toxic for the abundance that they have. And all of this was quite well received. And around that kind of time, I started going to conferences, starting in, I'm going to say, 97. And, it actually benefited me at that time that I did not have formal training in biology. Firstly, because the thing I did have training in was computer science. I was coming from artificial intelligence research, and that just gave me a new way of thinking about the problem that was different from what career biologists did. And that was allowing me to come up with good ideas that really, the people who were in the field should have had themselves, but they didn't.
So you're the pesky
The second,
outsider.
right. The second way it helped me, I mean, of course, this is not particularly unusual. The most conspicuous example that everybody always mentions is that the whole of molecular biology was invented by a bunch of physicists back in the 1950s. Um, but yeah, so the other thing was that it worked in terms of my um, gaining respect in the field. That people said, well, okay, this guy doesn't even know how to work a pipette, and he's having these really good ideas that we should have had. He must be really smart. So I was able to get listened to a lot faster than one normally would in the field. And then was the big eureka moment in the year 2000. So over the period, I'm going to say 98, 99, I had become increasingly uncomfortable with my own focus on mitochondrial DNA and realizing that, no, there was a lot more to aging than that, and I should be diversifying. And as time went on, of course, I was accumulating more and more knowledge about the field because, I mean, this is only a few years in, right? Um, but in the year 2000, I had this massive eureka moment realizing that actually repairing the accumulating damage in the body would be a lot easier than slowing down the rate at which the damage is generated, which was essentially the paradigm that was dominant in the field at that time. That basically that's what we already do with simple man-made machines. We don't stop rusting from happening in cars and aeroplanes. I mean, we minimize it as best we can, but we know that it's going to happen, and we live with that, and it's fine because we know how to remove rust every so often so that it doesn't get to the level of abundance that causes the doors to fall off. That's really all it's about. And it works. It means that is the reason why we still have 100-year-old cars that were designed to last maybe 10 years, right? And I realized that the same applies to the human body, because the human body is a machine after all. I mean, maybe it's a really complicated one, but it's still a machine.
Right.
So the big moment was when I realized that actually from what we already knew, we could actually envision a panel of interventions that would be pretty comprehensive in terms of repairing damage. Back then, really the only intervention in terms of damage repair that people were thinking about and knew about was stem cell therapy to repair one type of damage, namely loss of cells dying and not being automatically replaced by cell division. And everyone knew that it existed, but gerontologists didn't really pay much attention because they knew perfectly well that that was just one small part of the damage accumulation in aging, and on its own, it wouldn't make any difference to speak of. So they just didn't pay attention. So I was the first person to come along and realize that actually, if we included that as just one part of a wide panel of interventions, all of which I could sketch out in broad strokes, then we had a chance. And I started talking about this. And at that time, I was embarking on what happens when a scientist in any field comes up with a really dramatic paradigm shift. And I was not blind to this. I knew exactly what was coming to me because, as I say, I had been married to a biologist for nearly 10 years at that point, and I was familiar with what happens in such situations. So it was no surprise to me at all that initially almost nobody understood a word I was saying. And I was having to struggle, of course, to find the best way to explain it, which, in itself takes time. And so there was this very, fitful up and down period of at least 5 years, maybe 6 or 7 years, when I was just trying to get people to understand what I was saying and to read what I was writing, which initially they felt they didn't really need to because it was so irrelevant, and to understand that there were various areas of biology that they needed to get on top of, which had hitherto been completely irrelevant to gerontology, or they thought it was irrelevant. So that took time. And during that time, as you mentioned, there was some quite acrimonious controversy. It went through, it was very much a classical case of the Gandhi stages. First they ignore you, and then they ridicule you, and then they fight you, and then they pretend that they were with you all along, right? So the first stage took maybe 2 years. People they already knew that I was smart, as I mentioned earlier.
What year was this?
Well, starting 2000.
Okay.
I started really talking about this early 2001. So for the really 2001 and 2, people were just in stage 1. They knew I was smart. They knew that I'd published a bunch of interesting ideas over the previous few years. They kind of took the view that, well, this is obviously complete nonsense, but he's smart. He will come to his senses soon enough. Let us just let it happen, right? Then things started to change because journalists started getting interested. And my more high-profile colleagues started getting phone calls and having to actually express an opinion about the validity or otherwise of what this crazy guy was saying. And of course, the thing is, they hadn't actually understood what I was saying. And they knew they didn't understand it, but they also knew that they mustn't admit that they didn't understand it. So it was a case of get the journalist off the phone as quickly as possible in order to preserve one's image as all-knowing, right? And, so of course the best way to do that is ridicule, right? So I was the subject of a lot of that. But here's the problem that I had then. That was off the record, so I couldn't respond to it. So basically my only option at that point was to actively pick fights, to actually get a bit personal with some of the more thin-skinned members of the establishment, and to kind of, get people angry enough that they would actually set down in print their problems with what I was saying. So that happened in 2 forms, both of them in 2005. One of them in MIT Technology Review, and one of them in a journal called EMBO Reports, an academic journal.
Yep. Yep.
And of course, the result was I was able to, point by point, rebut very unequivocally the criticisms that were being made of what I was saying. And everybody who had any sense saw pretty quickly that actually, yeah, they had been overly hasty in dismissing this whole concept. Now, of course, it did because it got acrimonious and because there were lots of egos involved, it did take a few more years after that for all the dust to settle. But that's fine. That's how it's supposed to be. And by 2010, 2011, basically I was not having to explain myself anymore. And then the big kind of curtain the curtain was really heavily brought down on that whole period by the Hallmarks of Aging paper that came out in 2013, which was a root and branch restatement, not a perfect one, but a fairly good one, of what I had said 11 years previously. And,
Did you get cited?
And oh, no, on the contrary.
Of course not.
If they had cited me, they wouldn't have been able to publish the thing because of lack of originality, right? But that's fine. I didn't care about that. I was getting quite all the credit that I did privately. What mattered to me was that the idea was out there and being accepted as mainstream and orthodox. Right. And in fact, more than mainstream and orthodox. That one paper was by some distance the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging in the past decade. It is literally holy scripture in the field these days. The reason it's cited so much is basically all the citations are the same. They're in the introduction. They go, hello, here is what we're doing. You may wonder whether what we're doing is important and interesting. Well, the Hallmarks of Aging paper says it is, therefore it is. Now read on. That's kind of how it is. So yeah, I never have to explain myself anymore. Not to scientists.
Good. Excellent.